us sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. While we walk the pilgrim pathway, clouds will overspread the sky. But when traveling days are over, not a shadow, not a sigh.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Let us then be true and faithful, trusting, serving every day. Just one glimpse of him in glory will the toils of life repay.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Onward to the prize before us, soon his beauty will behold. Soon the pearly gates will open, we shall tread the streets of gold.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. I am weak, but thou art strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Through this world of toil and snares, if I falter, Lord, who cares? Who in me my burden shares? None but thee, dear Lord, none but thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be.
If you have your Bibles, I'd like to turn your attention to the 14th chapter of the book of Matthew. Matthew 14, we'll read together verses 22 through 32. Matthew 14, 22 through 32. The text says, "Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered and said to him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. This incident is recorded in the gospel records of Matthew, Mark, and John. Luke doesn't record any of it, but Mark and John make no reference to Peter's role in these events. And we want to focus on Peter's role. That's why I chose the text from Matthew 14. We want to focus on a very important lesson about faith, which can be learned from this interaction that Peter has with Jesus here. We want to make a few observations from this text to begin with, about 4 of them or so that are of some importance. First off, I want us to be aware that it was an intentional circumstance that was created by Jesus, this whole scenario. I want you to notice it starts off, he made the disciples get into the boat before him to the other side. Jesus choreographed the entire scenario. He made them get into the boat. He made them go before him. He made all of these things in this scenario happen in the way that it happened. He wanted them out in the boat without him. He wanted them alone for some time. He wanted the storm to be raging when he arrived. He wanted it to be a late hour. And I want you to notice when you get to the end of the section in verse 32, when Jesus steps onto the boat, immediately the storm stops. And so the storm is raging all the while, but when Jesus gets to the boat, the storm is finished. It served its purpose at that point. There's no longer a need for it. And so what we see in all this is that this is an intentional circumstance. He wants this scenario for his disciples to be separated from him, for his disciples to be on a boat at sea in a storm, and for it to take a long time for him to get there. He made sure, in fact, of all of these things. Look at verse 23, when evening came. Okay, so there's a delay. He's out teaching throughout the day, but now evening is coming. In verse 24, by this time. And so there has been a delay up this point between verse 23 and 24 of some length of time. And then in verse 25, in the fourth watch of the night. We have these time markers throughout these 3 verses, 23, 24, and 25, so that we understand that there is a passage of time and that Jesus is drawing this process out. John records that they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles. Matthew just says that they were far off, but John specifies that it's 3 or 4 miles off the coast. They had done this through rough seas and through strong contrary winds. They had been fighting this storm for hours. The general timeline of these events, he sends his disciples away. And then he dispersed the crowd. I don't know how long it took to disperse the crowd. I do know that there were thousands of people there, and I have been at events with thousands of people, and dispersing the crowd doesn't happen immediately. It's not like he just says, okay, everybody go home, and boom, they're gone. He sends the crowd away and makes certain that they go. And then he hikes up on the top of a mountain to pray. And then he descends from the mountain. And then he walks the 3 or 4 miles across the sea to where the boat is. And the text says it was the 4th watch of the night, and that means it was between 3 and 6 a.m. by the time that Jesus shows up on the scene. And so what we determined from this is that somewhere in the neighborhood of about 12 hours has elapsed from when he has sent his disciples away until the time that he actually comes walking on the sea and they see him. Thirdly, I want you to note that the storm was raging already. The boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. This statement is made describing the circumstances. When Jesus came walking up on the water, we've got terrible winds and terrible waves and all sorts of chaos that is going on. We need to not make the mistake of believing that everything is calm. And listen, I don't know if you've been around teaching kids Bible classes, but the Jesus walking on the water drawings is like a glassy sea. That is not what this is. So we need to make sure that we don't make that mistake and think that way. That's the way the drawings and the movies depict it often, but that's not what's going on. And this point actually makes an important difference in a little while, so keep this in your mind, that this whole time, from the time he puts them on the boat until he gets there, they are fighting the wind and the waves and this storm on the Sea of Galilee. Finally, I want you to notice that Peter understood Jesus and Peter understood the authority of Jesus. Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Now, I think it interesting that he said, if it is you. Now, we're told why he states it that way if you pay attention to what we're told in this text. We're told that when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost. And so they're not expecting the Lord in the middle of this storm to come walking out on the sea. They're not expecting a human being to be walking on the sea. They are expecting some kind of spiritual thing that's not material, because material things do what in the water? They sink. And so Jesus says, take heart, it's I, do not be afraid. Peter's response is, if it's you, command me. This is a way for Peter to confirm that in fact it's Jesus. If it's you, command me to come out on the sea and I'll be able to do it. And what that means is that Peter, knowing that if it's actually Jesus, then since how Jesus is the Lord, Jesus has the authority to command him to walk on the sea, and he'll be able to walk on the sea. He didn't think that he could do it on his own. He didn't think he could do it if anybody else commanded it. He said to Jesus, if it's really you, Lord, you command me to walk on the sea, and I'll be able to walk on the sea. And he knew. He knew what would happen if it was the Lord. Additionally, it's worth noting that after Peter got into trouble and began to sink, he knew that Jesus could save him. Beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. So this is not a picture of a man who doesn't know who Jesus is, who doesn't know the authority of Jesus, who doesn't believe in the authority of Jesus, or who lacks faith. He got out of the boat in the middle of a storm, and he walked on water because Jesus said, come. It's important that we understand that in order for us to learn a very, very important lesson about faith and about our walk with God. This thing isn't recorded because it makes for interesting, dramatic storytelling. Although it does make for interesting, dramatic storytelling, that's not why it's here. As long as Peter was looking to Jesus, as long as Peter is acting on the Christ's authority, he had no problems at all. What the record says is, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink. That is when we, speaking of faithful Christians, that is when we will become afraid. That is when we will get into trouble every single time, when we stop looking at the Lord, when we stop listening to the command of the Lord. Jesus said, come. As long as Peter was coming, he was fine. It was when he stopped and looked at the wind. When we stop looking at Jesus, when we stop considering his authority, and we instead look at the tumultuous storms of life that surround us, when that becomes our focus, our material existence and what's going on around us and what people are saying and what people think about us and what is happening to us and the disease, whatever, when that becomes my focus, that's when I become afraid. And that's when I begin to sink. I told you something was important earlier, and we're going to see it just here. Peter had faith. Peter believed that Jesus could command him. He believed that when Jesus commanded him, he could walk on the sea. He got out of the boat and he walked on the water and came to Jesus. That's faith, folks. This was in the middle of a storm. I'm not stepping out of a boat into the sea when things are calm. But they've been rowing for hours against the wind and against the waves, and the boat, it says, is battered by the waves. And he says, if you're the Lord, command me to come, and I can come to you. And he says, come, and he steps out of the boat into the water and begins to walk on the water. That's faith. That's trusting in the authority of Jesus. That's believing that the commands of Jesus have the power of God behind them. That wasn't his problem. After walking all the way to within reach of Jesus, it's not like he took one or two little steps and then got scared and started sinking. No, it says he got out of the boat and he walked on the water and came to Jesus. He walks all the way through those waves and wind and gets all the way to within arm's reach of the Lord. He's right there. We know he's right there because Jesus just reaches out immediately and grabs him. He's right there at Jesus. But he becomes afraid and he begins to sink and he cries out in fear, Lord, save me. Nothing had changed. Not a single thing about this event had changed. Jesus hadn't changed. He was the same. His authority was the same. His command was the same. His presence was the same. He was still there. He had still said, come. He still had the power. All of that was exactly the same. Nothing had changed about the weather either. It was the same. The winds were contrary. They had been all along. The waves were swelling. They had been all along. It was that way when Peter asked to be commanded to walk. It was that way when he stepped out of the boat. It was that way when he walked across the water. It was that way as he reaches Jesus. Hadn't changed a bit. The only thing that changed was what Peter was basing his confidence in. At the beginning of this story, Peter is basing his confidence in the command of Jesus. You command it, and I can come. At this point, he sees the wind. When he saw the wind, he was afraid. He's no longer acting on the command and the authority of Jesus. He's responding to the tumultuous sea that he's walking through. He is seeing the circumstances of his life. That's what erodes our faith. The day that we believed and made confession of our faith in Christ, the day that we went into the waters of baptism, the day that we were baptized and raised up, it's the same Jesus, it's the same commands, it's the same everything as it is today, but now I doubt, now I'm afraid, now I'm becoming overwhelmed by life. Why? Jesus hadn't changed. The commandments hadn't changed. I'm walking by sight rather than by faith. I'm looking at the wind and the waves. And I'm saying, wait a minute. Those swells are big. You ever been in the water? I've been in the Gulf of Mexico, quite a distance off the shore, on a little air mattress thing. Wasn't much to it. When the swells were so big, you couldn't see anything but a wall of water coming at you. And I understand this fear. Especially when they break over your head and now you're under the water. That's what happens if we start focusing, making decisions, concentrating on the circumstances of our life instead of on the power of our God and on His commandments as to what we should do. Jesus was still right there with Peter. And once Peter rightly refocused his hope on Jesus, once he began sinking and he was terrified and he said, wait a minute, you know what? Jesus can help me. Lord, save me. Once he did that, Jesus was right there. Beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him. That's how near the Lord is. We can't see the presence of God, but that's how close He is. That is how quickly He comes to our aid, immediately. Let's notice as well that Jesus didn't say that Peter's problem was that he had no faith. He did not say, Peter, why do you lack faith? He didn't say, Peter, you have no faith. That's not what he said. He said, oh, you have little faith. Why did you doubt? That's an important thing for us to remember as well. Doubts can attack the faithful. There is absolutely nothing extraordinary about a Christian having doubts. It simply means that we are distracted, that we are paying attention to the wind and the sea that we are walking through on this earth instead of paying attention to our God. Doubt and fear doesn't mean you've lost all your faith. I don't say because I doubt one day I'm an atheist. That's a lie of the devil. And the idea that if I'm a Christian, I'll never have a doubt is a lie that comes from the devil as well. It's a problem. It's a warning sign. It tells me that I'm not focusing all of my attention on God and that He is not first and foremost, and that I'm not focusing on His commandments and I don't trust in His authority and right to command me. It tells me all of those things, but it doesn't tell me that I don't believe, and it doesn't tell me that I'm not a Christian. You haven't lost all your faith because you doubt. What you've done is you've allowed your faith to wane because of the distractions of living in this world. That's what he tells Peter. Peter, you've been doing so good. You knew that if it was me, I had the authority to command you. You asked for the command. I gave the command, and you walked out. You stepped out of the boat. You walked across the water. The wind is blowing. The waves are crashing. You do fine. You get all the way to me. And then you start worrying about the world. Why did you doubt? After all of that, why did you start doubting? Do you notice he got all the way to Jesus? And he started doubting. I don't care how long you've been a Christian. A year, 5 years, a decade, 25 years, 50 years. I don't care. I don't care how close you are to the Lord. If you start focusing on the world, doubts will come. And you'll begin to sink. If this describes you today, don't settle for the fear. And don't settle for the sinking into the sea of this world. Cry out, Lord, save me. Refocus on God. Refocus on God's authority. Refocus on His command. Refocus on His promises. I want to turn your attention as we draw this to a close to the book of 2 Corinthians. In 2 Corinthians, the 4th chapter, starting in verse 16, we want to read a section of this letter that was written to the church at Corinth, a body of believers, much like us, removed from us by time and by distance and place and culture and all of those things. But still, people who have heard the gospel, people who have believed, and people who have repented and been baptized and are seeking to follow Christ in the world while they yet live in the bodies, and listen to what is written to them. 2 Corinthians 4 and verse 16, so we do not lose heart. That's what happened to Peter. Peter looked at the winds and he became afraid. He lost heart. So we do not lose heart. Though the outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing us for eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. That light momentary affliction, he's talking about his life. While we're in this body, living in this world, undergoing the things that we experience in this world, he says, that light momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond comparison as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient. That's temporary. But the things that are unseen are eternal. We know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this tent we groan, looking to put on our heavenly dwelling, if indeed by putting it on we may not be found naked. For while we are still in this tent, we groan, being burdened. Not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up in life. He has prepared us for this very thing, or he who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. So we are always of good courage. We know that while we're home in the body, we are away from the Lord. While we're living and inhabiting the material body that we are in, while we are living in this material world, we are away from the Lord. And then he says this, we walk by faith, not by sight. Peter was walking by faith when he said, Lord, if it's you, command me to come out on the sea, and I can. Peter was walking by faith when he stepped out on the boat. Peter was walking by faith when he crossed the waters and got all the way near Jesus. Peter was walking by faith, and then he was walking by sight when he saw the wind. And he became afraid, and he began to sink. Paul is writing to the church at Corinth and saying, don't do that. We walk by faith. We don't look at the things that are seen. We need to look at the things that are unseen. We don't put our hope and our confidence in this material world, in this material body. Those things are transient. We put our focus on the eternal things. And we fix our eyes on Jesus. And we walk at His command. Don't walk in fear because you're looking at the winds and the waves of life crashing at your feet. Instead, walk according to faith in the Lord. Lord, if you command me, I can come to you on the water. If you're trying to live off of your conversion, you're never going to make it. That event that happened when you came to faith, that's just the beginning of something. And if you're putting all of your hope on that event, you're never going to make it all the way to the Lord. If you spend every moment of your time after that event focused again on this life and the things of this life and the experiences of this life and the troubles of this life and the worries of this life and the lies of this world, you will become afraid. You will doubt, and you will begin to be consumed by the worries and the riches and the pleasures of this life. You have to continue to grow, continue to focus on the Lord, continue to walk in faith, continue to study His Word, continue to worship, continue to focus on the things that are not seen. Continue to lay up for yourselves treasures which are in heaven. Continue to add to your faith knowledge. And to knowledge, brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness, love. You have to continue. And as long as you're doing that, the waves can be 100 feet high. And you'll be as stable as the foundation of God. They won't prevail against you. The winds will not keep you. Life will not prevent you. Don't look at the winds. Look at the authority of Christ. Look at the power of the gospel. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes. That's still the case today. If we can help you in any way, let it be known as we stand and sing.
Time for me will be no more. Guide me gently, safely o'er to thy kingdom shore, to thy shore. Just a closer walk with thee. Grant it, Jesus, is my plea. Daily walking close to thee, let it